Friends, I am very grateful to Raziuddin Sahab, who has given me this opportunity to speak on interpreting Indian history, and to all those colleagues and friends who have decided to spare their time, precious time, in order to listen to what I would be saying. I am very grateful for this privilege. I should begin by saying that although there are various schools of history, there is very little difference of opinion among serious historians as to what historical method consists in. It first of all consists in a minimum of a priori assumptions. One has to go to one's sources as far as possible without any assumptions which can be questioned. The second important thing is that as far as one's historical sources are concerned, one must have a very critical apparatus. No book, however sacred, is beyond criticism by the historian. No tradition, no chronicle, no document. Its veracity is always under inquiry. If we remember these two particular principles, then whatever school of historians we belong to, which means that there are many schools which give various weights, let us say, to different factors in history: economic, social, ideological, political, and so on. Some emphasize the influence of personal characters, individuals, their private interests. Others, like Marxists, study classes and class conflicts and the influence of material conditions on ideologies, and so on. But the two principles that I have mentioned are basic. And it is from this point of view that I would like to consider the various interpretations of different phenomena in Indian history. At the moment, in India, the official atmosphere, at least, is not conducive to the scientific approach to history. There has been a process of what I would call mythic formation in the name of history and historiography, which is getting increasing support from the official establishment ever since the present political party and political grouping has come into power. In its earlier incarnation of 1998 to 2004, and in its present incarnation. First of all, there is, for early Indian history, there is what I call the Aryan Fixation. Since it cannot be denied that there is an Indo-European family, and the Aryan or Indo-Iranian segment of it cannot be just dismissed. Now the insistence is that Aryans originated in India. If this statement cannot be made directly, then at least anything which suggests Aryan migration into India is to be discouraged. In order to establish this fact, there is the second insistence that Rig Veda is very, very ancient. Whatever the linguistic evidence may say, it has been placed by serious archaeologists like Bibilal and others, a very early time, almost 8000 BC. And therefore, of course, if this is the date, then India must be the homeland of the Aryans, because Aryan immigration, worldwide immigration or old world immigration, began around 3000 BC or 5000 years at the utmost, while we are placing Rig Veda 10,000 years ago. This also means that the great Indus civilization is also Aryan, and in fact Vedic. We are seizing it also from Pakistan by calling it Saraswati Sindhu, as if Saraswati river, which is a very minor tributary of the Ghaggar river in Haryana and Punjab, was the major, formed the major region of the Indus civilization. The name Saraswati Sindhu is now coming into almost official usage, and let us see when the archaeological survey also adopts it instead of Harappan, Harappa being in Pakistan. This ties up with the effort to establish a Mahabharata archaeology, as if Mahabharata was not completed, as historians of literature are practically unified about around 200 AD, but was compiled much earlier, and actually Bibilal himself was later to be the Director General of Archaeology, started the whole project of Mahabharata archaeology, which Ghosh, the Director General of Archaeology at the time, in his foreword refuted. In the Indian Journal of Historical Science, there have been many essays, some contributed from people in America, giving astronomical dates, in which, by a curious unanimity, all recent dates were rejected as established by astronomical calculations for astronomical events, and only very early dates were then proclaimed as showing that ancient Indian literature, Vedic and late Vedic, was in fact very ancient. Now, this so-called Aryan fixation goes against all serious historians. Even a historian like R.C. Majumdar, who generally favored what I would call a Hindu-oriented interpretation of history, would not accept it. And I have yet to see a serious ancient Indian historian proclaiming it. But this is now going into our textbooks, or at any rate, whatever doesn't fit with it is then just ignored. So our school children are being taught to completely false ancient history. Not only linguistics, but archaeology and genetics, and of course archaeology as established in other countries, completely refutes this kind of mythology which I have laid out for you. I would particularly refer to a recent book, Tony Joseph's The Early Indians, which came out last year, in which he uses the latest archaeological and genetic evidence in order to lay out the case of Aryan immigration around into India around or slightly later than 2000 BC, not earlier. Actually, his own depiction of Aryan immigration based on genetics from Kazakhstan steppes through Afghanistan into India was also earlier established by archaeology, particularly through tracing the transportation of horses, the migration of horses along with the Aryans, because up till now there is no proof, despite some shady attempts about it, that the horse was known in India or in Indian civilization before the Aryan immigration and before the compilation of the Rig Veda. So genetics and archaeology are on the same page. And it is established that the Indus civilization has nothing to do with the Aryans. I may mention that the dates of Indus civilization are roughly, through carbon dating, through roughly from 2500 BC to 1800 BC, give and take a century here and there. And Rig Veda must be later. The religion of Indus culture is based on animal representations of divinities, whereas the Vedic lore of gods is human. The gods are humans except one or two, but essentially they are all human beings made into divinities. So this is a major difference. Then of course there is the difference about the symbols, which as far as possible since they have not been fully deciphered, but it looks as far as possible that they are related to Dravidian languages rather than Indo-Aryan. The second pillar of what I would call the present official line is to say that India as a nation was very old. And in late 90s, although now for some reason the RSS ideologues have become very careful about Gandhiji, there was an outcry that Gandhiji could not be called the father of this nation because the nation is as ancient as the Vedic times. This was very silly because in the Rig Veda there is no name for any territory larger than a tribal domain, let alone a province, a region, or the country. In fact, if one studies the concept of a country in authentically dated literature, even up to Buddha's time, there was no idea of India. The 16 Mahajanpadas were all in northern India. And it is only in Ashokan inscriptions in the 3rd century BC (150 years or more after Gautama Buddha) that the name Jambudvipa, the first name for India known to us, appears in Ashokan inscriptions. And then of course that was partly because the Mauryan Empire included most of India by that time. Then In Kharavela's inscription, 1st century BC, in Odisha, we come across the word Bharata. But Bharata subsequently becomes a word in inscriptions for the area to which the imaginary conquests of small rulers were confined, usually confined. There is no ode in Sanskrit literature to either Jambudvipa or Bharat. It is interesting that Yuan Chang says that in India among Indians there is no concept of the country, it's only a concept of foreigners. Indians only believe in their regional identities. The foreigners, of course, noticed that wherever there was caste system, there was India. And of course, the caste system did give, after it spread, perhaps originally from Kaushal and Magad in northern India to the whole of India later, perhaps even later than Ashoka's time, he never mentions the castes. But Megasthenes does, who came slightly earlier. But Megasthenes was a visitor to Magadha, unlike other Greeks whose experience was confined to northwestern India, and they never mentioned the caste system. They only mentioned Brahmins. So caste system and prohibition of intercaste marriages or limitation of intercaste marriages, all these began to spread practically after the Mauryan Empire. And then, of course, contributed to the, whether we like it or not, to the identity of India. But India as a larger country, a larger cultural entity, almost a country to be loved, is for the first time invoked by Amir Khusro in his Persian work Naus-e-Peher of 1318, giving us the first patriotic account of India, praising the Brahmins and their wisdom and their language, glorifying Sanskrit, mentioning all the regional languages of India alongside, praising the wisdom of Brahmins, praising India for contributing very correctly the game of chess, the Arabic numerals, hinsas, which the Arabics called Indian numerals, and the Panchatantra. This particular remark brings us towards the idea that unless you know about other countries, you can't be patriotic. With the coming of Islam and Persian literature and culture, India entered, in a sense, the international world, which it had only partly entered through the migration of Buddhism from India to China. And this is extremely important. The concept of a nation does not arise in isolation, or even of a country, native country, except when you are aware of other countries. I may mention here the further development of patriotism during the time of Akbar and Abul Fazl, where Abul Fazl even spoke of Kabul and Kandahar as the twin protecting gates of India. If you hold them, India is safe from foreign invasions. This particular strategic concept is never found in any other earlier writing. The strategic concept for India as a political unit. Similarly, of course, Abul Fazl was here following Al-Biruni. It's remarkable that there is no book in the Sanskrit language previous to 11th century, Al-Biruni's book on India, giving a particular cultural concept of India that Al-Biruni gave. And this is again repeated in Ain-e-Akbari of Abul Fazl. The English translation is very badly wrong here, because where Abul Fazl speaks of Indian culture, the translator, Jared, has turned into Hindu culture. And so, a huge misrepresentation of what Abul Fazl is saying. We now come to the religious sphere, where there is a wholesale misrepresentation of religious history in official India, by official India. The very term Hindu is Perso-Arabic. It is nobody in India before the 12th century, the 13th century, called himself a Hindu. A Hindu is from the Persian, derived from the Persian version of Sindhu, the name of the river. So Sindhu was to ancient Persians Hindu, and people therefore living beyond the Indus River were to ancient Persians Hindus, from where the Greek word Indian is derived, because the Greeks used to drop the initial H sound. So Hindu became Indu and then Indians. And this also went to Chinese, where Yuan Chong talked of Intu, and he noticed that of course Indians didn't know about Intu, and Indu in Sanskrit meant moon, it didn't mean the Indian country. So the word Hindu first applied to all Indians, as seen by Persians and Arabs, and then by easy shift to people who were not Muslims. First, a natural way in which Muslim emigres would see, and then see local population, and then of course, as others became Muslims, Hindu became the common word for non-Muslim Indians. Now this is not only a change of terms which ultimately non-Muslim Indians seem to accept, but it also meant a change in the perception of religion. It must be understood, which several dictionary makers in English don't understand, that religion is not confined to Zoroastrianism and its Semitic successors, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, where God, angels, Day of Judgment, heaven and hell are the essential concepts. In other religions, other traditions, whether Hinduism or Shintoism, Japan, what we call Hinduism or Brahmanism, let us say, or Buddhism and Jainism, the total perception is different. Rig Veda may speak of the one Ekam in the creation hymn, but monotheism is not the major philosophical trend in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Brahmanism, and certainly both Jainism and Buddhism reject monotheism. In fact, they reject any godlike force. Karma doctrine, on the other hand, came particularly to be the common doctrine of not only Buddhism and Jainism but also Brahmanism, as one could see from, for example, from Manu Smriti's concessions to the Karma doctrine, and even earlier in the late Vedic and Upanishadic literature. So these religious systems were different, and if one was asked about his religion in India in say 7th century, he would have been at a loss to answer unless he was a Jain priest or a Buddhist monk or a Brahman. Then the answer would be there. The Brahman would say, I am a Brahman. But others were free in beliefs in various godlings, local rituals, Buddhism or Jainism, at the same time that they also favored Brahmans. It is actually, in a sense, the coming of Islam that called everyone to account and relate his religion. So, along with the name Hindu came the new system of Hinduism in which you can see the 16 darshanas operating. So, in fact, religious history is far more complex than either traditional Hindu or traditional Muslim scholars would make it. Among Muslims, for example, Muslim historians, traditional historians and scholars, under the influence of the modern addiction to equality, Islam is regarded as an egalitarian religion, which would have surprised medieval Muslim scholars. Medieval Muslim scholars up to Mughal times may denounce Hindus as idol worshippers. But there is no criticism of the caste system. In no theological writing that I have studied by Muslims, there is ever a criticism of the caste system. It seems to them natural that there should be rich and poor, high and low, and therefore no particular idea of social equality. Perhaps equality in justice, but that also was a very dim concept. Now, clearly, therefore, and then as far as their counterparts from among conservative historians concerned, despite the fact that it was medieval times which really saw the spread of pantheism of Shankaracharya, the important fact that pantheism of Shankaracharya spread at the very time in what we would now call Hindu thought, at the very time that the notion of the pantheistic notion of Wahdatul Wujud of Ibn al-Arabi began to affect Indian mystic and Muslim theological thought. So that Jahangir, in a notable formula, said Tasawwuf is equivalent to Vedant, because in his mind pantheism had become dominant in Sufism and pantheism had become dominant in Vedanta. Clearly, therefore, there were substantial changes in religious thought in both Islam and Hinduism during the medieval period. Professor Pollock and others are making us realize that the medieval times are also very important for Sanskrit literature, for new ideas percolated. Let us recall that it was Dr. Tara Chand, the famous historian, who in a very important book in 1928 described the various facets and aspects of the influence of Islam on Indian culture. His hypothesis largely still stands. And it's a notable deviation from history that an attempt is now being made to show that the Islamic intrusion had no influence on Hinduism, or to show on the Muslim side that Islamic law in medieval times imbibed the modern concept of equality. Both these versions, ideological versions, are unhistorical. I would like to shift now to other matters. Notably on studying social and economic history. Where much work has been done in India, both as far as ancient and medieval history are concerned. Much of this work was under Marxist influence, and D.D. Kausambi and R.S. Sharma, as far as ancient times are concerned, are made outstanding contributions. The difficulty here is that although class structures are always found in agrarian and post-agrarian societies, and therefore class struggles between those dominant and those who are put under, and sometimes within the upper classes and also among the lower classes, struggles occur on land and so forth. So class structures are important. But the view that pre-capitalist structures would be similar all the world over, that there would be simple variations of feudalism preceding capitalism, or that there would be versions of Oriental despotism where tax and rent are equivalent, and that commodity economies or money economies could not exist before capitalism. All these simplistic versions, as I would say, of Marxism have been challenged through detailed research. A money economy of a developed kind existed, for example, in Mughal India, without it being a capitalist or proto-capitalist economy. So a tax rent equivalent, which is supposed to be the basis of Oriental despotism, existed alongside a very developed mercantile economy. Similarly, Professor Rajesh Sharma's classic work on Indian feudalism did establish that there were similarities, particularly one would say in Rajaputra knighthood, to European feudalism. But these similarities were in fact superficial, since it could not be established that ancient India in its later stages had anything comparable to serfdom, and that of course is the basic institution to Marxists of feudalism. Therefore, let us agree that although there is great scope for working economic history and also of defining classes and class struggles, these phenomena in India or in China or in Central Asia or in Middle East would not be identical, but there would be large regional variations, though class society and class struggles exist among them. Another branch of history which has developed or sought to be developed in the last 30 years is women's history. It was, I think, a great failure on the part of earlier histories to see in history only men's history, and in fact to overlook the exploitation from which women have suffered through centuries in practically all civilizations. The supposed inferiority of women was almost a universal trait in world civilizations. Even in Dutch civilization, on women's skeletons it has been found that women were not given meat to eat, whereas men were. And of course, one knows the inferior position women occupy in the caste system, in Christian law, canon law, and in Islamic Sharia. Therefore, women's history is a field that has to develop. It might be recognized that this doesn't actually weaken the thesis of classes and class struggles, because actually the suppression of women was ideologically a very important element in the ideology of the class system. Males in exploited classes were also exploiters as far as their wives and daughters were concerned. And therefore, what one would say an exploiter's ideology percolated and in fact assisted the class order. It is this relationship, I would suggest, that also needs to be examined. Finally, because my time would soon be running out, I would like to speak on two matters of more recent history. One relates to not only Indian history but to world history. India was, from 1757 onwards, the major colony in the world. It was the major remitter of tribute to England. And after the development of the Industrial Revolution, a major captive market also. And Marx in his Capital had actually emphasized the primary accumulation of capital in the colonies as a major source of addition to industrial capital. Unfortunately, British historians almost totally overlooked this chapter. But to their honor, it was many Englishmen, beginning with Adam Smith, who saw the network of exploitation. And they first worked out in different manners what the tribute consisted in. And then, of course, we have our own Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt in the Victorian age bringing this out. Unfortunately, in Indian histories, the whole issue of tribute is drowned in the description of political history. At the same time, there is a particular communal outlook in describing resistance to British rule, which needs to be condemned. For instance, the almost illegitimization of Tipu Sultan as an opponent of British rule, officially. Just recently, even those Mapilas who were put in an airless cabin and put practically to the most painful kind of death have been expelled from the official list of martyrs by an organization of which I was once chairman. Thus, in a sense, 1857 is also being communalized. This kind of treatment also spreads to the treatment of the national movement. Things have gone to the extent that the national movement is being read only as a Hindu movement, to which, of course, our colleagues in Pakistan have also contributed. By running by trying to establish that the Muslim anti-colonial struggle can stand on its own, a totally unhistorical position. In the national movement, all classes of Indian people, except perhaps some top landlords, were interested, were involved. And I think R.B. Dutt, the main Marxist historian of national movement before 47, understood it despite his rather unfair criticism of Mahatma Gandhi. The national movement, by its very definition, was a united front movement against British rule. And this should always be borne in mind when we consider its history. Why a large number of Muslims separated from it is an issue that will engage historians for a long time. Religion and ideologies play a part along with, and perhaps sometimes in opposition to, economic interests. But as far as we are concerned, as historians, whether we are in India or Pakistan, we have a common history before 1947. After 1947, there is a crescendo of voices, official and sometimes non-official, which recite a critique of the policies followed from 1947 to 1991 as policies of socialism. As Nehru said of the Karachi resolution of the Congress of 1931, it was not a socialist resolution, it was a kind of welfare state resolution. The Congress had made that promise, it was necessary and proper to fulfill it. It is forgotten that during these 40 years or more, landlordism was practically abolished. That India had some of the best labor laws in Asia. That much scientific and technological development took place during that period. And the low rate of growth, the so-called Hindu rate of growth, concealed the fact that ordinary Indians ate more per capita than they do now, as has been pointed out by notable economists. Therefore, let us not be guided by current journalistic or official doctrines, but see the data of the period and the work of that period, not only in rates of GDP, but also in the form of distribution of property. Finally, I would say that we are in the midst of a battle of ideas. Our constitution had once spoken of composite culture. That is a banned word today. And the drive to denigrate the national movement is now common between both India and Pakistan. Clearly, RS has little to show as far as its own nationalist credentials go. It has to rely on a kind of Sardar Patel epic, but that is not sufficient. It can't explain why all over India its leaders and functionaries celebrated Gandhiji's murder. So, there are reasons why the national movement too is being put on one side and its history. I believe there are moves that would remove the national movement as an important course in history syllabi, in public service and other examinations. So there is an ideological battle underway in India. Those of our colleagues who are abroad, to them I would recite a misra what Jigar Muradabadi wrote in Persian. Chasm kusha wa janib-e razm gahe watan nigar. Open your eyes and observe the battle being fought in your country. Thank you.